I'm going to talk now about the Iconography and Transformation project. This is the fourth project in three-dimensional visual thinking. One of the aspects of this project that can be nice for people in the class who have been working within a lot of restrictions up until this point is that this project is entirely without physical limitations. You can work with any materials that you would choose to and virtually in any direction that you want to. It does have some guiding principles. This is not just free-for-all. It does have some organizing principles about it. But in terms of materials and how you construct this and how you put this together, it's entirely your own decisions, which is both good and bad, as you know. With a lot of freedom can come some anxiety about that too, or some apprehension, or just some decisions about what you have to make. So in terms of the materials for the project, anything is available. The only requirement being that it has to be, we have to be able to see it. You have to have it there physically present in the studio for both the in-process critique and the final critique. This project has, excuse me, this project has three major emphases in it. The first is to expand our understanding of the range of symbols and their meanings, specifically religious symbols or Christian symbols and their meanings. Related to that would be also to research the history and use of these symbols in different faith traditions. One of the things that you find that I have really noticed about individuals that come to Bethel University, because we often come from a Protestant tradition, not exclusively, but mostly from a Protestant tradition, we don't necessarily have a rich understanding or a deep understanding of the value of these traditions or even the scope of these traditions. For most Protestants, for example, our sense of symbolism is quite thin. You know, we have a cross, we have, you know, maybe the little fish decal that's stuck on the back of a car. We might have, you know, Easter lilies, Christmas trees. Maybe we're kind of nervous about those a little bit, but our sense of symbolism is actually quite shallow. And so this is an opportunity to explore some of that, to enrich some of that, and to think about possibilities and how to expand our range of symbolism. Symbolism is actually a really rich part of a spiritual vocabulary. It's not only, you know, certainly there's a lot of symbolism found in artwork and, you know, movies and you know, books and, you know, visual art and so on, but it's also part of a strong spiritual tradition as well. It enriches us and it gives us a language in which to talk about things, in which to value things, and ways to think about spiritual ideas that are different than a lot of the, maybe you might say, exposition that we do in a lot of Protestant churches, which is a lot of explaining. Rather than experiencing, we tend to explain a little bit more. So there's a couple of reasons for thinking about spirituality and symbolism, and we want to do that. That, however, is the smaller part of the assignment, and we'll talk about what that actually looks like in a second. But the third part is we want to look specifically at physical materials and look around our environment a little bit and start to see our physical environment in a different way and understand that and start to integrate that into what we are doing in this project. This project has two parts. The first thing that I'd like you to do is to do some symbol research. And the second part of this is making a physical object. The first part of this research, the smaller part, is you are to research some symbols from a faith tradition for this project, cataloging and defining 6 symbols for possible use. I'd like you to draw these into your sketchbook. You will be presenting one of these symbols to the class in a brief and informal presentation. As we're sitting down there at the Bigelow Chapel, we're just going to sit around and you can talk about these. A key part of the symbol research, however, is that it's really important that you cite your sources and historical context for the symbols that you are researching and selecting. And the reason that this is a big deal, or reason that this is important, is because symbol research is really nothing without social context. One of the key symbols that we see in Easter, for example, in Protestant churches, is the Easter lily that often shows up at the foot of the cross. I've been at Protestant churches where there's 150 of those things spread across the front of the sanctuary. And it's like, well, why Easter lilies? Nobody seems to know, other than they're called Easter lilies and they always show up there. Well, I can tell you what that history is about. In the Middle Ages in Europe, where this lily emerged, that lily, because of its bright whiteness and because of its size, became a symbol for purity. And because of that, it became a symbol of the Virgin Mary. And so that is why it always shows up at Easter. It's not just, a symbol of sort of plant life or spring. It really is about sort of the Virgin and the Virgin's relationship to Christ, which is, clearly the center of attention at Easter. And it's always very interesting. It's kind of like the Christmas tree at Christmas. The Easter lily at Easter is something that we've embraced as Protestants, but we don't really think about it. So is that functioning as a symbol? I don't think it's functioning as a symbol. I mean, it doesn't sort of mean things to us in the way that, other than just sort of showing up at Christmas. It's a nice decoration. However, you go back to the Middle Ages, that thing clearly is functioning as a symbol. So you find that the symbols are really, they're heavily influenced by geography. They're heavily influenced by culture, location. As Christ was walking around and teaching with his disciples, he often talked and used language that was, they talked about fishing, they talked about boats, they hit like these things were symbols because they were seafaring people, fishermen and whatnot. And so this became part of the symbolism of Christians at that time. Is like literally symbols of fish, anchors, ropes, boats. All of these things became symbols because of the geography. Likewise, if you take and some of these same Christian ideas and you go to Central Europe, like where the lily just came from, that I was talking about comes from. One of the things that the reason that's the case, that emerged at that time in that place, is because this was not by the ocean. These were people who are, well inland, and so many of their images and many of the symbolism of the church at that time are connected to agriculture, gardening, livestock, flora and fauna. At that time in Central Europe, Middle Ages, 70–80% of the population was connected directly to the land in terms of farming or supporting farming directly in some way. Most people were illiterate. And so the experiences in church reflected that. A lot of the symbology was kind of played out in these visual symbols. And so many paintings from the Middle Ages, as you see these things, they have very great attention paid to sort of animals, critters, and plants that these people would have come in contact with, because there was tremendous amounts of folklore that were associated with those plants and animals. Dogs, for example, were associated with the idea of fidelity. So there are paintings that were made at that time in which at the feet of the happy couple there's literally a dog. It's like, well, what is that doing there? Well, that's a symbol of fidelity, because dogs are, very loyal to their owners. And so this kind of language became part of the lexicon, the way that people interpreted their spirituality, the symbolism of their spirituality, and all that stuff is, if you know how to look at it, if you know what you're looking at, it's encoded those works, and it's present in those works, and it informs those works in very deep ways. So this is what I want you to do, is I want you to research some of those traditions. You can look at, flora and fauna, animals, creatures, numbers. There's a million ways to kind of slice this and look at this. But that's what I want you to do, is to dig into this and find something, research something. I would ask you to just find something that's meaningful to your faith tradition, however you want to interpret that. As you know from previous projects, I tend to write project descriptions pretty carefully and use language that's quite specific. So for the second part of the project, this first sentence is the most descriptive and the most helpful. You are to make a physical object in which there is a dynamic relationship between a symbol and a material. The key word in this is really dynamic. Dynamic relationship is one that is active. It's a relationship in which there's a generation of possibilities, in which it expands into other kinds of conversations. Many times When it comes to spiritual ideas, we're much more comfortable with ideas that are expressive, ideas that are persuasive, even ideas that are perhaps more along the lines of expositional or theologically analytical. And I'm really not asking for those in this kind of relationship here. What I'm asking for is something that's dynamic. And if we look at the example of theater, as we have a couple times before in the class, I like going to theater because it's something we're pretty familiar with. I have a lot of examples of that to speak from as well. But if we think about dynamic relationships in theater, theater is all about conflict. But that conflict is not necessarily random. These are not just sort of random people, random, things put together for no reason, conflicts occurring for no reason. Really great theater is about strategic conflict, where two characters or several characters or many characters, each of which has their own perspective, their own ideas, the things that they are passionate about, or the things that they're concerned with, and these come together, and these conflicts are exposed. People work through these conflicts in various ways, or not work through these conflicts in various ways, and then there is some kind of accounting of that, or some kind of way of thinking about that. And in really great theater, this it's strategic, and one of the things that we'll see as we start to look at a few artworks here up ahead of us is that the artworks that do this are likewise also strategic, but they're dynamic. It's a dynamic relationship in which there's real tension, there's questions, and so these are perhaps pieces that are more open-ended, and they're not necessarily conclusive statements where you're saying, this is what I believe as a theological person or spiritual person. This is more like, I have this really great question that I want to ask that I maybe don't even know the answer to, and I just want to put it out in the world so that we all can think about it for a little bit. That's a dynamic tension. So that's what we're after with this one. I would say that to the second part of this description, the relationship between this material, the physical materials, and the idea or the symbolism should be the primary focus in the work, and you are to consider and develop the physical qualities of the work to a very high degree. That does not mean that I want something that's super polished and super finished. What it means is that I want that relationship to be the key thing that we are experiencing when we are looking at the piece. For this project, you're allowed to use any materials that you would like to, with two caveats. One is that the piece has to show up and be physically present during the critique, and the other is that you can't use live animals. Okay, so with those two things on the table, I would just say that other than that, anything is entirely fair game. It doesn't have to be permanent at all. Materials that people have used for this project in the past have used everything from soil, wood, things that they buy on Goodwill, things that they have owned and altered, smoke, fire, water, ice, craft materials, clay, pretty much anything that you can think of that could be manipulated in some way for the project has been manipulated into successful projects for this class. I think a key idea in doing this is, what is happening with these materials? Why are you using, the materials that you are using? For example, if one of the first things that I said was wood. If you go to Home Depot and you get a bunch of wood, half a dozen 2x4s, and you bring those into the studio and you make something out of those 2x4s, that's a very different kind of language than if you wander out into the woods and you get a tree stump that has fallen down, or a piece of wood, or a big branch, and you bring that in and you make the wood out of that big branch. These are two very different material languages. These are two very different material sensibilities, and each of which is informing your piece quite a lot. It's becoming kind of the language of the piece. So if we think about the example that I talked about earlier, the lily, so if you carve a lily construct a lily perhaps out of wood that you get from Home Depot, that's one kind of language. If you carve it out of wood that you found in the woods or constructed out of another set of materials that you found in the woods, that's something else. The wood you get from Home Depot has been delivered to you through an entire social mechanism that revolves around money and commerce and industrialization, and that's how it gets to you. All of that becomes part of the piece. The wood that you find out in the branch you find out in the woods, has not gone through that, and so it has a different history, and that history affects what you are doing. So likewise, we can think about that lilies. Maybe you want to carve that lily out of a piece of stone. Then that lily has a different set of associations because the stone is a different set of visual and physical characteristics. Or what if you fabricated that lily out of steel? All of these impact the piece in different ways, and some are much more dynamic than others, and some are much more intensive than others. And so I think it's good to be thinking about relationships, like I said, that are dynamic, that have some really great tensions, and to intentionally go after that. And to also be thinking about, maybe think with your hands a bit, rather than think with your mind, what do I want this to be? It's like find some really fun tensions just by looking around in your environment in playful ways. To the second point here, stay away from conventional, expected, or traditional solutions. Create some fireworks. I think that's a great objective in this one. Don't be afraid to upset the apple cart a little bit. I think we're all friends down in the studio, and you can make the piece that you want to make, and nobody is going to think it's anything more than an interesting experiment. We're not going to necessarily assume things about you because of that, or theological ideas or whatnot, but take some risks, I would say. And finally, if you've seen it before, don't make it now. So, and that includes anything you find on the web. Don't be finding this piece and then fabricating it, but generate it from yourself. We're now going to take a look at a dozen or so artworks by various artists. These are existing pieces that are out in the world now that actually illustrate what I'm talking about in creating a dynamic tension between a symbol and a material. Some of these might be a little challenging, might be a little difficult. That's a good thing in the confines of the art experience and the aesthetic experience. Things that are challenging are often very profitable. Not always, but often very profitable. This first work is a photograph by an artist named Andre Serrano. And back when I used to teach ICA, I used to love to show this image and put it in front of the group and ask people to describe what they are seeing. Invariably, people would talk about how beautiful the image is, the image of Christ, and it's his golden glow, and the light, the quality of the light, down on the Christ, and so on. And I like to start with that, not to trick people, but I like people to sort of experience a piece because then I would describe it. The title of the work is Piss Christ, and it is really what it sounds like. This is, as I mentioned, it's not a sculpture, it's a photograph. This is a photograph in which the artist Andre Serrano took a cheap plastic crucifix, put it in a jar, filled the jar with urine, and then photographed the cheap crucifix through through the urine, and then get this really sort of beautiful photograph. At which point in ICA, people would become outraged, and they would start to talk about blasphemy and sacrilege, and where is this guy? We need to talk with him, and whatnot. This is a difficult piece, and admittedly so, and I do like to put it out in the world, because over the 35, 40 years that this piece has now been in existence, when it initially came out, there were a lot of individuals that had various kind of perspectives on it, but over time there's been a bit of a sifting process. And what's happened is that a lot of the Christian community, Christian theologians, Christian critical writers, people who write about art, have actually really warmed to this piece and come to embrace it in some pretty profound ways. And there's a couple of reasons for that. A lot of the essays that I have read about this piece from those Christian perspectives talk about this piece really being about the humanity of Christ. That, for example, one of the challenges that people find in the piece is an acknowledgement that Christ was a real guy walking around who, at least once or twice had to urinate. And this was a physical reality for Christ, and yet we tend to maybe intellectualize our spirituality to such a degree that we're very uncomfortable with ideas like that. And I think this is very, very true for Protestant traditions. I think Catholic tradition, Orthodox traditions tend to be a little bit more comfortable with, kind of these more intimate physicalities of Christ because of their acceptance of certain theological doctrines, where we tend to perhaps take a much more Western approach, a much more, analytical approach, where our spirituality is often intellectualized. And so this piece, which, as I said, does tend to acknowledge, the deep physicality of Christ, is challenging in many ways. I've also heard the writers talk about this being about the incarnation. We often don't think about what the incarnation must have been like to, from God's point of view. And I've heard one or two people sort of talk about how they felt that this piece kind of represented that. In any case, there's a lot of ways that this piece can be interpreted, but this is not necessarily a statement that is meant to be only provocative. And I think that that's a limitation that a lot of the early writers had about this, or a lot of people who are upset about this, is they think that it's exclusively meant to be provocative. It is meant to be sort of, upset us a little bit in the way that, we maybe think about our ideas about physicality and spirituality, or, Christ and physicality. But it's not meant to be, simply that. It's meant to sort of lead us into another kind of conversation. And I think that it does that quite effectively. This is a work by artist Cosimo Cavallaro, probably 5 or 6 years old at this point. Another depiction of Christ, of a crucified Christ, that also deals with symbolism and materiality in some pretty compelling ways. What you're looking at here is a full-size mold of a man, adult male, probably about Christ's age when he was crucified. And the artist Cavallaro made a mold of the individual and then made a piece entirely out of chocolate. So everything that you're looking at here really is chocolate, probably 150 pounds, I'm guessing. And it's suspended up in an exhibition space. And this piece came out just before Easter. Like I said, it was probably 5 or 6 years ago now. And this work has, when it was put out into the community, I think that it also garnered a reaction. Again, the goal is not necessarily to make people angry. That's not where I'm going. But maybe what I would say is, at times art finds it necessary to make people angry, or perhaps is unafraid to create a reaction in the service of finding ideas that are sort of interesting, compelling, and expressive, and it's going to speak to us as humans. Qualities of this piece that I have always really enjoyed. There was a bit of genius, I think, in Cavallaro putting this piece out, right before Easter. Again, it's we as Christians in the United States in the 21st century, we have these traditions. In Easter, for example, we have chocolate Easter bunnies, we have images of the Christ. How do these two things relate? I really don't know how these two things relate to each other. There's always this weird tension in terms of how these are connected. What is the relationship between these two? And often we just sort of accept their dual presence at Easter without really thinking about it too much. And I like the way that Cavallaro just forces these two things together. So instead of the chocolate Easter bunny, we have the chocolate Jesus. Who is, ready to be broken, for us, so to speak. And it does break some boundaries. It's a little transgressive in the sense that it tends to embrace humor, even a pretty wry or ironic humor about this very serious subject. But at the same time, I also think that humor is not without purpose. An aspect of this piece that I actually really liked a lot is the way in which this piece speaks into another aspect of Easter. It's like, well, one aspect of Easter is the way in which we kind of have this weird association with chocolate and religion, but another aspect of this is, Easter really is about communion. And, my body broken for you. And so Christ at the Last Supper, is there a more direct example of, this is my body, take and eat? I think this is really it. And sort of the joy of that, or the celebration of that, or on one level, for us as Christians, the gift of that, and I think it does actually capture that aspect of it. And so, like a lot of really great artwork, it has tensions. It doesn't mean exclusively one thing. It can be interpreted perhaps in a couple different ways, and a lot of those interpretations are uncomfortably contradictory at times. The fact that it is a little humorous, the fact that it does sort of make light to some degree of some serious subject matter makes me a little uncomfortable, but yet at the same time, it's a really sort of wonderful experience. And I find it challenging at multiple levels because of that. Another work that uses Christ imagery, but in a far more subtle way, is this piece by Anthony Gormley titled Bed. Gormley is a British artist, an English artist, who makes a lot of work that almost all of it references his own body in some way. He uses his own body as kind of the model, explores the physicality and the space of his own body. If you look closely at the image, you'll see that the piece is made up of slices of bread. In England, you have this sort of crazy processed bread you get at the grocery store that's almost completely square, and this is the bread that Gormley is using. So you have two very large, loaves, so to speak, in which there's a void in the center, and the void, if you look carefully, you can see that it's in the shape of a human, which is actually the shape of Anthony Gormley. So Gormley theoretically could sort of lay down in here. You could put one loaf on top of the other one, make a gigantic Anthony Gormley sandwich, and he would fit very nicely in there. It's all theoretical, of course, because you wouldn't want to do that, but it's interesting to think about this work, and it's helpful to know one aspect of this to parse out what this piece might be about, or some of the themes that Gormley was playing around with this piece. Gormley actually ate the bread that is missing in these two large kind of mattress-like stacks. And so the bread that is there, it's not that he just sort of left that out, is that he actually sort of got up and ate that bread. And so this experience becomes not just one of describing the physical space of his body, but acknowledging that that the bread actually became sort of energy and became Anthony Gormley himself. And I think this is a really wonderful piece. It's just ridiculously simple and kind of beautiful in the way that it's an acknowledgement of all the things that we eat, and we don't really think about this. But also at the same time, very much like the previous piece that we just saw, the Chocolate Jesus by Cavallaro, I feel that there's a layer in this piece, or an understanding of this piece, that's also about communion. My body broken for you. This one perhaps is even more direct. I'm not sure that Gormley would necessarily be comfortable with that as the exclusive interpretation of this, but clearly there's a relationship there between sort of body and eating, and body and energy. And so this piece has, again, sort of multiple layers to it. I really enjoy the fact that it also works on kind of this very physical level, in terms of physics. We take food in, mass becomes energy, solid matter becomes energy, walking around. I think that that's a very nice metaphor, and I think it's a very nice idea to contemplate. Another work by the artist Cornelia Parker deals with this idea, or the tension between symbolism and materials, perhaps coming more from a material sensibility this time, where the previous ones are perhaps a bit more about specific symbols. This work, I think it's helpful in looking at this work to look beyond the work and see the exit sign just beyond the piece, to give you an idea of the scale of this piece. I don't have exact dimensions, but I'm guessing it's a good 18 feet tall. It's quite a large object hanging in a space, not uncharacteristic of Cornelia Parker's work, that tends to be, she often will sort of hang pieces in gallery spaces, create these sort of floating atmospheric structures. In this work, Cornelia Parker has gone to a site of a church that was destroyed by arson, and she has collected a lot of the charred wood, brought all that back in the gallery, and then assembled this back up into some facsimile of some kind of a structure. I love the history of the material here, and I think that this is maybe a compelling thing to think about in terms of this project. Materials come to us through many different directions and means, and we all are aware of this. We go camping somewhere, we pick up a stone from the place that we camped. It may not actually be all that different from the stones of our house, but it's meaningful because it comes from this location. People give us things that are meaningful, not because we value the thing, but because we value the way that it got to us. And there are many ways in which objects become infused with meaning, become loaded with meaning because of their history, their provenance, and the way that they got to us. Museums are full of experiences like this, objects that famous people might own. And we sort of look at these things and are marvel at the way that they're both simultaneously sort of strange and familiar, because they're kind of ordinary in one sense, but they're very extraordinary in another sense. And I think that the provenance of this material, the history of this material showing up as coming from a church not destroyed by fire, but destroyed by arson, which is important, which is an act of malice, which is an act of hatred and violence. That this object showing up, and this Christian church, which is so much looking forward to resurrection, that it's simultaneously about that. I like the way that the piece evokes both of these things: a certain rising again, a certain sense of resurrection. And also acknowledges the reality of hatred, or the reality of violence. Again, the piece is open-ended. It's not necessarily a clear sort of testimonial. This is what I believe, and this is my big theological statement. It's more of a question. It's like, what does this mean? What does the resurrection look like in terms of this structure, this time, this space? A related work by Cornelia Parker is this piece titled My Soul of Fire. It's a good example of what happens to artists, or for artists occasionally, is that we find things in the world that all we really have to do is to put it out, claim it, put it out there, and it becomes an authentic artwork on its own right. I believe that this piece came from the same site as the materials from the previous work we were just looking at. It is a hymnal, and the hymnal has been charred all the way around the edges to the point that it's completely falling apart. And the hymnal's been opened up. If you look carefully at the top left, you can see that it's been opened to the page titled My Soul of Fire. Aspects of this piece that I really enjoy, that I really like, are the fact that the charring on the outside is such a contrast with this pure white on the inside. And I like the way that the book becomes almost a surrogate experience. I think we've all had excuse me, those moments where we've been through experiences that deeply affect us on the outside, but there is maybe something on the inside which is hopefully left untouched. It feels very spiritual in that sense. I also think that the metaphor "my soul of fire," or the phrase "my soul of fire," becomes a bit of a metaphor, a bit of a question here. I like in the work the way that the piece starts to ask me questions about, what does it mean to be consumed? That in Christianity, a big idea is that we must die in order to live. The idea of being consumed or being used up is a question that sort of lingers in the Christian. For Christians, like, what is the nature of that? How does that really work? To what degree? What is lost and what is burned up, and what is retained? And I think that this piece is just a lovely question that allows me to think about those things. It doesn't necessarily answer those questions for me, but allows me to think about that in my own way, in kind of a personal way. This next work is a piece by the artist Mona Hatoum, who is a Palestinian artist who is mostly a sculptor, but works a lot with a wide range of materials, and is very much about this idea that material sensibilities and material histories are really integral to what the materials mean, and really loves to embrace material histories in her work. This is a large-scale map. I don't have dimensions on this, but I'm guessing, looking at the top of the slide image, that it's probably 10 to 12 feet wide. What you're looking at here are 2,400 blocks of olive oil soap. The olive oil soap have beads that are pressed into them that outline a series of territories. Mona Hatoum, as I said, is Palestinian, and what she's referencing here in this particular work is a set of territories that Israel agreed to give back to Palestine in the Oslo Accords of 1993. And if you know the history of Palestinians and Israelis. It is one where land becomes really a site of great conflict and great tension. And so what Mona Hatoum seems to be suggesting here with the piece, which is large and expansive, is this sort of giving back of these parcels of land. It has some aspect of washing, or there's an aspect of this which is about cleaning or cleanliness. A need to do this, or perhaps a desire to do this, over these contested territories, over these contested locations and sites. And so while the imagery here is perhaps more ambiguous or less direct or readable for us, without knowing the deep and complicated history of these two nations, it is clear that what she's talking about is really creating a landscape with this soap, and talking about the need for some kind of renewal, some kind of washing, or perhaps the washing as a metaphor. I've always sort of suspected that this piece was about claiming that Israel giving back these territories was a form of sort of cleaning themselves of a larger transgression of sort of establishing, the nation of Israel without, in a pretty unilateral way. Anyhow, that's just perhaps my reading on this. But the idea of these large, expanse of soap, I think is a beautifully stunning object. I think it's very dense and very rich and just really beautiful. I like the different colors that are represented here, just on a physical, tactile level. I think it's a really gorgeous object that speaks well into a conversation that she's wanting to have about the relationship between these two nations. Here we can see a close-up detail of the olive oil soap. The way that they make this soap, by the way, is to literally, because refrigeration is such a big thing, that when they make this soap, they literally spread, mix this up. It's a heat process, and then they spread this out on the floor and then cut this up. So these soap factories, you literally just the entire floor of the building is covered in this soap, which is then just sort of cut up and stacked like this. And then the beads, which are pressed into the surface of the soap, is visible here as well. The piece that you're looking at here is by artist Damien Hirst. Damien Hirst is a contemporary artist who does a lot of work using human body parts, animal body parts. That's his medium, as well as a lot of other kinds of ideas as well. Hirst, in this particular piece, started with a human skull. He acquired a human skull of a 35-year-old male from Europe who was born roughly 1750 or so. Surprisingly, it's actually not that difficult to acquire, materials like this. So Hirst acquired the skull, worked with some jewelers and some craftspeople, and made a perfect reproduction of the skull in platinum, which he then had covered with diamonds. There's about 1,100 carats of diamonds here, about 8,600 diamonds or so. They're flawless diamonds, and they cover the whole thing all around. As you can see, there's a very large one on the forehead, which is about the size of a large acorn or a small walnut. And then after all of that process, Hirst then inserted the original teeth back into the skull to give us this vision of, that we're seeing right in front of us right here. The raw materials for the work cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $24 million. Hirst eventually sold this piece for about $100 million. Which is ridiculous. It's ridiculous on many levels. However, there's something about that ridiculousness that I actually kind of like, and we'll see why as we look at the next slide. Hirst's work, the one that we saw in the previous image, is actually part of a tradition, and it's a contemporary tradition that maybe hasn't been taken up much, but back in the Middle Ages in Europe, remember that Hirst he is European, he's from the UK, but back in the Middle Ages in Europe, there was a long history in the Christian tradition of reliquaries, or venerating bones or bones of saints and so on. So a revered figure, holy figure, man or woman would die. They would inter the individual for some time. After a while, they would disinter them after all the soft tissue was gone and use the bones then to, the bones would be sort of disseminated to various locations, and people could come and they could venerate, pray to, pray in front of, light a candle in front of it's a votive experience, a worship experience to be in front of these relics, they were called. And as part of that, reliquaries, which were the holders of relics, reliquaries were created, and some of these were just kind of crazy ornate. And so one of the things that you're seeing in front of you here, the object that you're seeing in front of you right here, is actually a reliquary cross from France at about 1180 or so. It's a silver object with gems. And if you look at not the first crossbar at the top, but the second crossbar in the middle, right in the center, there's a little brown square. In the center of that, there's a little brown thing. And what actually is in the center of that is a little fragment of wood, just normal kind of acacia wood or some kind of a darker hardwood. And it is believed, according to the provenance or like the beliefs around this, that was actually a fragment of what was called the true cross, which would be the cross that Christ was crucified on, which, if you can imagine, that would be just a tremendously holy relic. And so however they came upon this thing, they felt it was a relic from the Christ's cross of crucifixion, and then they sort of worshipped it and created this really strangely paradoxical object where you have thousands and thousands of dollars in materials and gems and jewels and gold and silver surrounding these other tiny little bits of wood that are completely worthless aside from the fact of the maker's belief in the fact that they were actually part of the true cross. So what's happening with the Hearst piece, which again is I'm not sort of claiming that that's necessarily a piece that I want to hold up as the epitome of Western art, but I would say that it's very much part of this tradition of thinking about material histories and how to have a material conversation. How the history of a material can start to inform it, what is meant by different kinds of value. One of the things that I've always really loved about these these antiquated reliquaries, like the one that you're looking at here, is the degree to which they represent and hold different types of value. You have sort of monetary value and then tremendous spiritual value, and they're intersected. There's such contradiction. There's such funny relationships between these two that I enjoy those. So again, the goal of this in Hearst piece, may be varied, but I would say at the very least we can appreciate the sense in which there's an image here, a Christian image, a Christian tradition that he's absolutely participating in and absolutely a part of as he makes his piece, which is titled "For the Love of God." I'm going to look at a couple works by a Chinese artist named Ai Weiwei. And Ai Weiwei is a very well-known artist right now. He is of a Chinese ancestry and origin, but he really kind of works all over the world and is speaking to larger global causes. Very interesting person who's very interested in issues of social justice. He's coming to this idea of imagery and iconography from a very different place. But I do think that how he regards materials, his material sense, historical sense, is an interesting point of conversation as we think about this idea of imagery and materials. The work that you're looking at here is an Ai Weiwei jar that he had overpainted. The original jar itself was a Chinese object from about 260 BC, is from the Han Dynasty. And Ai Weiwei has done a number of these objects where he's taken ancient pottery, old pottery, and basically just kind of tractor paint and painted over these, Coca-Cola logos and other kinds of, logos like that as a way of thinking about, from his perspective, he often talks about what China is doing to its sense of the past. Over the past 15 years or so, China has gone through a tremendous revolution in terms of, transforming cities, transforming the nature of where people work, and so a lot of the old structures and a lot of history is literally being bulldozed and destroyed and ruined in many ways. And so that's something that Ai Weiwei starts to explore in a number of his pieces. This one right here, where he more or less desecrates this very ancient and frankly irreplaceable object. It's not like it's the only one of its kind, but it's absolutely an irreplaceable object. You don't just get these, down at the 7-Eleven. And by desecrating it by painting this contemporary thing on as a, I would say, kind of a prophetic experience. The way that he is looking at what the larger Chinese culture is doing to its own history. I think that's really the conversation here. Another related work that was even a little bit earlier was this piece is in front of you. It's actually a set of photographs, but it's documenting a performance. Again, Ai Weiwei working with a Han Dynasty urn, about that same age, about 2,000 years old or so, where he holds the urn, simply lets it go in the middle photograph, and then the urn is clearly destroyed in the right photograph. In this piece, again, not necessarily religious iconography, but certainly the material sense or the symbolic sense. There's a strong intersection, a strong dynamic relationship between the materials and some of the images and the ideas that are represented in the piece. And Ai Weiwei in this one seems to be talking about Chinese history and how contemporary China is regarding its own history. Another work by Ai Weiwei, who perhaps expands outside of the range of this assignment, not dealing with necessarily relief, but absolutely dealing with meaning and how materials can become infused with meaning and become really powerful because of their proximity to others, or the materials, the way that they can become infused with the energy of people's stories. He was very taken by the Syrian refugees as they sort of left, and they ended up in Greece and Southern Europe. And images like this, which were very common 3 or 4 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, and Ai Weiwei was very taken by this, and so he actually spent some time in Greece and Lesbos and those areas where these refugees were landing. One of the things that the refugees would do is they would sort of go across the sea in these boats. And assuming that they made it, they often didn't make it, but assuming that they made it, the goal then was clearly not to sort of hang out at the coast, but they would dump all of these life jackets and pretty much just walk away from all this stuff and head towards a new life in Europe. And so Ai Weiwei started collecting all of these life jackets and collecting some of this detritus and this castaway materials because he felt it was so evocative and so powerful. It had become loaded with all of the symbolism and all of the power of the experiences that these people went through. Ai Weiwei made a number of pieces subsequently out of the life jackets. This is one that's at a Berlin concert house. I don't know if you folks were politically aware at that time when this was going on, but there was a lot of pushback because of all of these refugees, especially in Germany. All these refugees, a lot of them were moving into Germany, and there were political parties in Germany that were deeply opposed to this. And this strikes a very deep chord in Germany, of course, because of their history with the Jews in the Second World War, and the Gypsies and other people groups in the Second World War, their refusal and persecution and whatnot of those groups. And so Ai Weiwei wanted to respond to that, to maybe make a work that forced people to confront these difficult situations. And so he made this piece, and like I said, at the Berlin concert house, where he used some of these life jackets that were left over from the Syrian refugees and just constructed them, put them there. He's done other pieces about the Syrian refugee crisis where he uses materials from those, but this is one that's probably the most direct and probably one of the most charged, given the history of Germany, the reluctance of some people in Germany to take in these refugees, and the particular history of that country. The work that you're looking at here is coming from another tradition, and that is of the sort of Middle Eastern prayer rug. The artist Faid Ahmed has done a number of these. I'll be showing you two, in which he uses traditional Afghani and sort of Middle Eastern, kind of from the region of Afghanistan is where this tradition emerges. But the prayer rug, which is a Muslim object where you sort of kneel on this during the 5 moments of prayer during the day, and you point the point towards Mecca, and then you are praying towards Mecca. Fade Ahmed, in his works, he kind of literally deconstructs these prayer rugs by using the same traditional methods of weaving these things or having them woven. I'm not sure to what degree he does these himself, or to what degree he's borrowing from borrowing the work of other people, but he's certainly having them made. But they are intricately woven, very dense, very finely crafted, and yet they're a very contemporary sensibility. The work that you're looking at right here, the top half clearly is, very much the traditional prayer rug with all the images and icons, all of the little glyphs, the little embellishments, the little motifs, visual motifs and patternation that really define those prayer rugs on the top half. But then on the bottom half, you have this very contemporary and very much informed by a digital world experience where the rug seems to literally be melting right in front of you. Again, what's actually happening here is this is all entirely a woven rug, but it has the illusion of sort of melting or blurring or changing in front of you. And again, this is another example of religious imagery, symbolism, iconography being directly challenged as a way to get at other more poetic truths. And in this case, I think Ahmed is really talking about contemporary Islam and the way that contemporary Islam is, the traditional values within that culture, within that religion, are being sort of deeply challenged by a digital culture in which a lot of the kind of relationships and other things are really not holding fast. Another artwork by Fade Ahmed, again a woven rug that has been altered. So everything that you're seeing here is woven in a traditional, what are called Oriental rugs, but they're really kind of Afghanistan area rugs. But it's all woven. This is not a computer printout. This is not anything that's been sort of processed by a machine. This would all be sort of hand woven in a traditional manner. Again, we can see this again, distortions coming into play. You have the traditional weaving, probably 70% of this, but then you have this fantastic Technicolor trippiness, almost LSD kind of experience, visual experience in the center, as it clearly starts to become influenced by more contemporary ideas, visual ideas, more contemporary situations. The final artist we're going to look at today is an artist named Chris Martin, who's from Belgium, and whose work is actually would be a good plan of research if someone is looking to find an artist to look at, maybe to explore some other ideas. Maybe you're interested in this topic, but he is an artist who uses a lot of Christian imagery, from crosses, crucifixes, things like that, but uses them in very different ways to speak into perhaps what he might define or others might define as a post-Christian culture. How do we understand Christian symbolism in a culture where Christianity is no longer dominant? And he's definitely interested in that conversation and pursuing it. The work that you're looking at here is titled Altar, and the imagery is pretty specific. Anyone that is studied art history, Western art history in particular, will remember this image pretty readily, and I'll show you where this piece comes from in just a moment. The image itself is put out sort of facing the sea. Chris Martin, in talking about this piece, wanted to think about the potential of this frame, sort of looking out at the sea. For him, the spaces of this altarpiece, and this is the root image or the root iconography here is of an altarpiece. The images and the panels are always changing. They're always moving. There's a dramatic shift in this piece where the altarpiece that you'll see shortly is one of really specific imagery and iconography. And what Chris Martin has done in this work has shifted that. And so where in one we maybe are looking at historically based images of Jesus and the disciples and the Lamb and whatnot, in this one that he has created for us, we are looking instead at the natural world, and we are finding, forms of inspiration there, finding levels of inspiration and peace, perhaps even as he might describe it in this particular piece. This is the original that Chris Martin was referencing when he was making his piece altar. This is called the Ghent altarpiece by Jan van Eyck. It's very large. It's Chris Martin's piece is scaled to it, and it's a very rich, complex bit of Western Christian art history from about late 1400s or so. Flemish painter Jan van Eyck, who painted this. You see Adam and Eve on the top left and the top right. You see God, you see the patrons down in the central panel down below. There's a lot of imagery, with lambs and, kind of very, very dense, thick Christian iconography that would take some time to be parsed out. One of the curious things about these altarpieces is in that time and place, they were not always left open and exposed. They actually are hinged. And so if you were to take the pieces, the panels on the left and the right, where Adam and Eve are, you could actually fold those in, so the whole thing fold in just like shutters on a window, which is why they have those curious kind of half moon shapes and moon shapes up on the top. So. The last thing I would say about this project is start collecting, get some materials. It's time to get started. Like a lot of the other projects, I think a good takeaway from some of the previous projects that we've done is that it's often best to have an idea, an initial idea, collect some materials, start experimenting, but maybe don't try to define everything before you start. Maybe allow, hold the idea loosely, allow some spontaneity, allow some experimentation to inform the process. So that's all. Thanks. Have a good day. Get started.